The wind howled through the dry plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant storms. In the heart of the small town of Glenstone, where the horizon stretched endlessly beneath a fading sun, Isabella Thornton stood alone at the window of her father's grand house, her eyes tracing the winding road that led out to the edge of nowhere. She had once loved this place, this house, and the people in it. But all of that had changed when her father's business had failed. Now, everything that had been hers, the name, the land, the reputation, was slipping like sand through her fingers. Her father, once a powerful and respected rancher, was a broken man, bankrupt and disheveled. He had no choice but to let the townsfolk come in and take their cut. But Isabella? She had no say. Not anymore. Not after her name had been tarnished with the rumors of her father's failed dealings, and certainly not after the debt collectors had shown up on their doorstep, demanding more than they could pay. The Thornton name, once a symbol of wealth and pride, had become a laughingstock. She had no escape. The walls of her father's house, which once stood as a fortress, now felt like a prison. And then came the day the arrangement had been made. Her father had looked at her through bleary eyes and with a weariness in his voice. "It's for your own good, Isa. We can't afford to turn down his offer." She had tried to argue. She had begged him to reconsider. But in the end, there had been no choice. The match was made, an arranged marriage, an alliance forged in desperation. But the man she was to marry was not the rich, powerful rancher she'd expected. He wasn't even a man of wealth. He was a servant, Lowell Carter, a ranch hand who had worked on their property for years, loyal to her father in ways no one could truly understand. Her heart had burned with humiliation. She had been forced into this. Her dignity had been stripped away by circumstances she had no control over. Isabella could feel the weight of their gazes on her, the gossip, the pity in their eyes, as they watched her forced into the position of a woman with no choices, no future. She was to marry Lowell Carter, the man who had worked under her, cleaned her boots, and fixed her broken fences. He was to become her husband, her partner in a life she could not escape. Isabella trembled as she looked out the window, watching the sun set behind the hills, the last remnants of daylight bleeding away like the last of her hope. In the distance, she saw him. Lowell Carter. He rode in from the stables on a dusty horse, his weathered hands tight on the reins, his broad shoulders stiff under the weight of a world she could not imagine. His gaze met hers as he rode closer, but he did not smile. He never did. He was a man of few words, just like she remembered. A man who had lived under the thumb of her father's commands, but one who had never once asked for more. As he came closer to the house, Isabella's heart sank. This was the man she was to marry. This was her fate. A servant, a man bound by duty, with no voice of his own in the matter. She had once thought she could love a man of stature, of strength and power. But now, it seemed that love would be a commodity she would never know again. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of silence and strained conversations. Isabella's once strong resolve had begun to fade, like a river running dry under an unrelenting sun. Her father had all but withdrawn into himself, absorbed by the consequences of his failures. The townsfolk, too, were too wrapped up in their own gossip to offer anything other than pitying glances or whispered remarks. But none of that mattered now. The day had arrived, and with it, the weight of an unbearable reality. The grand house, once a place of laughter and life, felt suffocating. The silence was heavy, filled only by the distant sound of horses' hooves and the clink of metal as servants prepared for the ceremony. Isabella stood alone in her room, staring at the reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress, white and ornate, clung to her like a second skin, but it did little to mask the sense of suffocation that had settled in her chest. Her hands shook as she adjusted the delicate lace around her neck, and for a brief moment, she considered running. Running far, far away, into the dust and the wind, where no one could force her to live a life she hadn't chosen. But she had no strength left to flee. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see her father standing in the doorway, looking older than she had ever seen him. His face was lined with age and regret, his hands trembling as he held a letter. "It's done, ISA," he said, his voice cracking. "We've no choice, but he's a good man, Lowell is. He'll take care of you. He'll protect you." Isabella's heart clenched in her chest. "He's not a man of choice, Father," she replied, her voice strained. "You've decided this for me." Her father winced, but said nothing. There was nothing more to say, after all. Lowell Carter stood outside, waiting. His expression was impassive, as always, but there was something in the way his jaw tightened that made her pause. Perhaps, in his silence, there was more than duty at play. The ceremony was brief. They exchanged vows that neither truly believed in. The townsfolk, who had gathered to witness the union, looked on in awkward silence. No one dared to speak, for they all knew that this marriage was not built on love, but on the fragile hope that it might somehow fix what was broken. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Isabella felt a hollow ache in her chest, a void where joy should have been. There were no promises whispered in the night, no soft kisses stolen under the stars. There was only the rustle of her dress and the weight of an unwanted future. Lowell, too, was silent as they walked back down the aisle. His hand brushed hers, but it was awkward, like two strangers coming together for the first time. She could feel the tension in him, the wariness, as if he was just as unsure of this as she was. The town would never know what it cost them both to stand there. The weight of their eyes, the whisper of judgment, the silent condemnation that hung in the air like a fog. The evening that followed the wedding was a long, silent affair. As night fell over the ranch, the sounds of celebration faded into the distance, and Isabella found herself in a world of shadows. The grand house she had once known now felt like a hollow shell, its walls echoing with ghosts of a life she had no longer been allowed to live. Lowell led her to the small cabin at the edge of the property, his cabin, she reminded herself. The place where he had spent his days in service to her father. It was nothing like the grand home she had grown up in. The cabin was simple, humble, just a single room with a fireplace, a bed, and a worn wooden table. The walls were lined with shelves that held tools, books, and the remnants of his life. A life she now shared, whether she wanted to or not. They sat at the table in silence, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Isabella could feel the heat from the flames, but it did little to ease the chill in her heart. Her hands, which had once been soft and graceful, now felt like foreign things, rough and unfamiliar. She clasped them together, resting them in her lap, trying to hide the trembling. Lowell sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He had taken off his boots, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the muscles of his forearms, and the faint scars that ran across his skin like the story of a man who had seen far too many battles. His eyes flickered briefly to her, but then quickly moved away, focusing on the fire. Isabella wanted to say something, to ask him what he felt, to demand answers. But she couldn't find the words. She didn't even know if she wanted the truth. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. She was a woman locked in a life she hadn't chosen, and he was the man forced into a role he had never sought. They were bound together, but there was nothing warm or tender about it. Not yet. Lowell cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You don't have to stay here, you know. If you want your own space, I can." "No," Isabella interrupted, her voice sounding harsh even to her own ears. She softened, immediately regretting her tone. "No," she repeated, quieter this time. I don't know what I want, Lowell. I just know that I'm not the woman you thought you'd marry." He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, she thought he might simply let the silence swallow them whole. But then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't place. "I didn't expect much," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not from this marriage. Not from you. But I do expect honesty. We are both here because of circumstances beyond our control. But that doesn't mean we can't find something in it. Something that's ours." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She had expected him to be bitter, to resent her. But instead, there was only a calm acceptance in his voice, a quiet resolve. Something in his words made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this after all. They didn't speak again that night. But as she lay in the small bed, listening to the sound of Lowell's steady breathing across the room, Isabella couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this than she had first believed. In the darkness, she thought she heard the soft rustle of paper, Lowell's fingers sifting through something. But when she looked over, he was only sitting there, staring into the fire, the glow of the embers casting his face in deep shadow. Days passed, the rhythm of life continuing in its quiet, unhurried way. The seasons shifted from autumn to winter, and with the changing of the leaves came the slow, subtle transformation of the two people who shared the same small cabin. The land was unforgiving, as it always was, but now it seemed to speak to them in ways it hadn't before. The harsh winds outside mirrored the silent tension inside, and yet, despite it all, a bond began to form. It wasn't one born of passion, but of necessity. Of shared burdens and daily toil. The ranch needed tending, and together, they worked. Isabella had learned the way of the land, her hands toughening as she worked the fields alongside Lowell. She mended fences, tended the animals, and carried water in heavy buckets, learning the quiet strength that had long been his. There was no more hesitation between them, only the simple act of survival. The land didn't care for their marriage, their pasts, or their futures. It simply was, and so were they. One cold morning, after a particularly heavy snowfall, they went out to tend the livestock, their breath visible in the sharp winter air. As they worked, a sudden crack of thunder echoed across the plains, strange for this time of year. A storm was coming, one that threatened to bring more snow and ice. "Better get back to the cabin," Lowell said, his voice cutting through the howling wind. His eyes were narrowed, scanning the sky. Isabella nodded, but before she could turn, a sharp, sudden pain flared in her side. A burst of icy cold gripped her chest as she stumbled, her foot slipping in the snow. Lowell was there in an instant, his strong arms catching her before she fell, his grip firm and steady. For a moment, everything went still. She could feel the heat of his body through the layers of their clothes, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her, and the roughness of his hands as they held her. There was something unspoken between them, an intimacy that neither had asked for, but both now shared. His touch was gentle, yet it carried a weight of promise, of something that could never be fully explained. "I've got you," Lowell said, his voice low, as though the words were meant only for her, and no one else. Isabella's heart beat faster than it should have, and she quickly pulled away, the cold air suddenly feeling too sharp against her skin. Her fingers, still trembling, reached for the rope in her coat pocket, her wedding ring still hanging on the thin string around her neck. It was the one thing that had never felt right, the symbol of a past that she couldn't shake. Lowell, as if sensing the shift, didn't push her. Instead, he gave her a space she hadn't expected, a silent acknowledgement that she could still control her own world, even if it felt as though she had lost it all. They didn't speak as they hurried back to the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. The storm hit with fury once they were inside, the wind howling and the snow piling high against the small cabin. It was a bitter night, and as the fire crackled, Isabella found herself sitting near the hearth, her hands warmed by the flames. Lowell stood by the door, his eyes scanning the storm outside, as if his mind was still out there, somewhere. She couldn't help but watch him. The way he carried himself, tired, burdened, but steady. And somehow, she felt safe, for the first time in months. "I don't need your protection, Lowell," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. His face was tired, but there was something in his eyes that held her captive. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean I won't offer it anyway." For the first time, Isabella's heart softened. She didn't know why, didn't know what had shifted in that moment. But something had. She could feel the slow, quiet warmth building inside her, a flicker of something more than survival. Something that felt like the beginning of trust, of tenderness. Winter lingered long in Glenstone, the snow thick and heavy across the plains, turning the world outside their cabin into a silent, white wilderness. The storms came and went, but each time they came back, they came closer. The wind bit at the edges of the world, and the fire inside was the only warmth to hold on to. In the weeks that passed, Isabella found herself growing used to Lowell's presence. Not in the way one grows accustomed to the sound of rain or the light of the moon, but in the quiet understanding that she was no longer alone in the world. The days were still filled with work, the ranch had to be tended, animals fed, firewood cut, but now, each action was performed with a companion, however reluctant or unspoken that companionship might have been. There were still moments of silence between them, awkward pauses that came when neither knew what to say. But there were also moments when words seemed unnecessary, like when they sat on opposite sides of the fire after dinner, the light flickering in their eyes, or when she found herself laughing at something he said, his voice rough but warm with humor. Isabella had never known Lowell to speak much about himself. He was a man of few words, his life etched into the roughness of his hands, the stiffness of his shoulders. But over time, she began to notice the small things, his soft chuckle when he noticed the way she struggled to carry a load of hay, the slight softening of his gaze when she caught him staring at her across the room, as if he too was measuring something. There was a tenderness there, but it was slow to grow, like a seed planted in soil that needed time to break through the surface. And still, there were the unspoken things, things that neither of them could name but both knew existed. One cold morning, a few days after the storm had passed, Isabella stood at the stove, stirring the pot of stew. Lowell sat at the table, peeling potatoes with the same steady concentration he applied to everything. The rhythmic sound of the knife scraping against the skin was oddly comforting. "I didn't expect this," she said suddenly, the words surprising her more than him. She wasn't sure what she meant, she didn't know if she was talking about the ranch, the life they now shared, or the strange sense of peace that had begun to settle between them. Lowell didn't look up from his task. "What did you expect?" She didn't have an answer right away. Instead, she turned to face him, her hands resting on the edge of the stove, as if the heat of the fire could warm the cool air between them. "I don't know. I thought I'd hate you. For being here. For being the man my father chose for me." Lowell paused, the knife still in his hand. "And you don't?" She swallowed, the weight of her own words pulling her into a deep, uncharted space. "No, I don't. Not anymore." There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I didn't expect you to trust me. But it seems like you do." Isabella nodded, her chest tightening at the truth of it. The walls she had built around herself had started to crumble, not all at once, but in slow, deliberate pieces. And though she had never allowed herself to trust anyone in a long time, Lowell had somehow earned it, without asking, without demanding anything from her. "I do," she said softly, her voice unsteady with the weight of it. He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his words were simple. "That's enough for me." Spring came, though it was slower than the years before, creeping across the land with a hesitant warmth that pushed the snow back into the hills. The earth seemed to breathe again, stretching out from its cold slumber, and Isabella felt something inside her stir with it. The days were still filled with labor, tending to the livestock, mending fences, and planting the first seeds in the small garden they had started together. But there was a new rhythm now, one that felt less like survival and more like living. In the quiet moments, when the wind wasn't so harsh and the sun lingered just a little longer, Isabella began to feel the stirrings of something she hadn't expected. It was not love, at least not in the way she had once dreamed of it. There were no grand gestures or passionate declarations, no sweeping promises under the stars. But there was a tenderness in the way they moved together, a comfort in the small, quiet moments. Lowell had taken to repairing the barn that spring, his hands working with steady precision, while Isabella spent the mornings at the garden, pulling weeds and turning over the soil. She would watch him from time to time, his broad shoulders bent in concentration, his face set in that familiar, stoic expression. He had changed in small ways too. His back was less stiff, his gaze softer when it met hers, though still not eager to linger. But it was a change. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the small porch of the cabin, watching the last traces of daylight slip behind the hills. The evening air was cool and smelled of fresh earth and new growth. The fireflies had begun to emerge, their tiny lights flickering in the dusk. Isabella had been quiet for a long time, lost in thought, when she realized that she didn't feel the same weight in her chest that she had before. The weight of her past, of the shame and the resentment, had started to loosen, slowly. Lowell was beside her, his gaze on the horizon. She wondered, for the first time, what he was thinking. "What happens when we get old?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet, almost playful in its uncertainty. Lowell glanced over at her, raising an eyebrow as though the question had caught him off guard. "When we get old," he repeated. "Guess we keep working, same as we always did. Maybe sit out here some nights, watch the fireflies." She turned to face him, searching his face for some kind of answer, something more than the practicality he always wore. But he was silent, staring out into the dark, and for a moment, she thought he might not answer at all. "Do you ever want more?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "I don't know if I ever thought I could want more. But I've got this. This ranch. You. That's enough for me." The simplicity of his answer, so steady, so unassuming, settled something in her chest. It wasn't the kind of love she had imagined as a girl. It wasn't some passionate, fiery bond. It was a slow burn, one that had built up over time, through shared glances, quiet actions, and trust given where none had been expected. Isabella looked down at her hands, worn from work, but strong. She had once believed that love was something that swept you away. But now, she understood that love, true love, was built in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, in the simple act of being there for one another. It wasn't grand. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And that was enough. "Maybe that's enough," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Lowell didn't say anything, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward ever so slightly, just a hint of a smile. And for the first time, Isabella saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, something like contentment, something like peace. The moment lingered between them, but neither rushed to fill it. It was enough, this silence. The shared understanding that had taken root between them, small and quiet, but undeniably real. They had built something together, even if they hadn't seen it coming. And that, Isabella realized, was the truest thing of all. Summer arrived like a breath of fresh air, and with it, the land came alive once more. The garden Isabella had planted grew tall and strong, the vegetables ripening under the warmth of the sun. The ranch, too, seemed to come into its own again, the fences mended, the barn standing tall against the backdrop of a sky that seemed endless in its promise. But though the ranch was thriving, there was one thing that had remained unchanged, the wedding ring that still hung around Isabella's neck. She had never removed it. The ring, tarnished and worn, was a reminder of a past that had bound her to a life she hadn't chosen, a life she had long since grown to resent. Yet, it remained close to her heart. It was a weight she hadn't yet been able to shed, no matter how much she wished to. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, Isabella sat on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Lowell was just finishing up with the horses, his movements sure and practiced, the rhythmic sound of hooves on the ground echoing in the quiet. Isabella, lost in thought, felt the familiar weight of the ring at her neck, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to look at it. She had avoided the ring, never truly confronting it, as though acknowledging it would somehow bring the past back to life. But now, as the sun set and the earth seemed to sigh beneath the weight of a summer evening, Isabella realized something. She had spent so much of her life feeling bound by her past, feeling chained to the mistakes and judgments of others. But this was her life now. This was her future. And the man who had once been a servant, a man she had been forced to marry, had shown her more love and loyalty than she had ever expected. It was time to reclaim what had been taken from her. She stood, the sound of her boots against the wooden floorboards breaking the stillness. Lowell looked up as she approached, his brow furrowing slightly in silent inquiry. "I need to do something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something she hadn't felt before, or resolve. "I need to let go of this." Lowell didn't ask her what she meant. He simply nodded, his expression quiet, but understanding. He didn't need to ask. He knew. Isabella took the ring in her hand, feeling the coolness of the metal against her skin. She stared at it for a moment, the symbol of her past, the thing that had held her down, the thing that had once defined her. But now, it felt like nothing more than a relic of someone else's life. She walked toward the fire pit at the edge of the porch, where the last embers of their evening fire glowed softly in the dark. She held the ring over the flames, her fingers trembling just slightly. And then, without another word, she dropped it into the fire. The metal twisted and curled as it fell, the flames licking at it, turning it black and unrecognizable. Isabella watched as the ring disappeared into the fire, the final tie to a past that no longer had any hold over her. For the first time, she felt lighter. Lowell was beside her, standing just a step behind. His hand brushed hers briefly, a quiet gesture of solidarity. His touch was warm, grounding. "You don't need that anymore," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. Isabella nodded, her heart beating faster now. She had reclaimed herself. She had freed herself from the chains of the past, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly living. The fire crackled, the last of the ring's remnants disappearing into the flames. The night around them was calm, peaceful, as though the earth itself had recognized the change that had taken place. The days turned longer, and the heat of summer bathed the land in golden light. The ranch thrived under the steady hands of its new owners. The fences were sturdy, the cattle were healthy, and the crops bloomed in the soil that Isabella had once doubted could yield anything. There was a rhythm to their lives now, a quiet harmony between them, forged by the work and the shared space of their world. But it wasn't just the ranch that had changed. The bond between Isabella and Lowell had evolved, slowly, unspoken, but undeniable. Where once there had been hesitation, now there was understanding. Where there had been resentment, now there was trust. Lowell's presence in her life had started as something imposed, something forced by circumstance. But now, Isabella realized, he had become the cornerstone of everything she had built, not just the ranch, but her own heart. She had come to depend on him in ways she never expected, not just for his strength, but for the way he saw her, truly saw her, without the weight of judgment or expectation. One evening, as they stood side by side in the barn, working together in the cool, evening air, Isabella caught herself glancing at Lowell in a way she hadn't before. His strong hands, rough from years of labor, moved with an ease and precision that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. The quiet way he went about things, his steady gaze, and his presence beside her, it had all started to mean something deeper than she had realized. Lowell seemed to sense the change, though neither of them spoke of it aloud. He was no longer the man who had stood at a distance, unsure of where he stood in her life. Now, there was a kind of quiet devotion in everything he did, the way he repaired the fences with a care he hadn't shown before, the way he would stop whatever task he was doing to help her when she needed it, the soft way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. One night, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire together. The air was cool, the sky stretched out above them like a canvas of stars, and the flickering firelight danced between them. It was the first night they had been alone in a long while, no work to attend to, no responsibilities pressing in on them. "I didn't expect this," Isabella said softly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "This peace. With you. With everything." Lowell looked at her then, his dark eyes catching the firelight. His expression was unreadable for a moment, but then, as if deciding something, he spoke in that quiet, steady voice of his. "I didn't expect it either," he said. "But I've come to know that peace, it doesn't come all at once. It comes in small ways, over time. In trust. In understanding." Isabella's heart tightened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth of his words. She had spent so much of her life running from judgment, from her past, from the pain of being forced into a life that wasn't hers. But now, in this moment, she realized that what she had with Lowell wasn't something forced. It wasn't something that could be coerced or controlled. It had grown, slowly, between them, nurtured by the work they did side by side, by the trust they had slowly built. "I trust you, Lowell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing hers. The touch was simple, yet it held more meaning than any words could convey. There was no grand gesture, no declaration of love. But in that moment, Isabella felt the weight of it all, the years of pain, of sacrifice, of struggle, and how, in the end, they had created something more beautiful than she had ever expected. Lowell didn't speak for a long while, but when he did, his words were the softest she had ever heard. "And I'll always be here. No matter what comes." The fire crackled softly between them, the stars above shining as brightly as the trust that had been built between them. There was no grand promise, no declaration of forever. But in that simple moment, they both understood that love, true love, was built in the quiet spaces. In the shared glances, the small acts of kindness, the trust that had been earned, not demanded. And for the first time, Isabella felt something she hadn't thought possible: hope. Not for a perfect future, but for a future built on love, on trust, and on a partnership that had come slowly, but steadily, between them. The sun was setting on the ranch, casting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and as Isabella stood on the porch, watching the colors shift across the horizon, she felt something deep inside her, a quiet satisfaction, the kind that only comes when you've worked the land and lived the life you've built from the ground up. Lowell was in the barn, tending to the animals, his movements steady and sure, the muscles in his arms rippling as he worked. She could hear the familiar sounds of the ranch, the soft nicker of horses, the clucking of chickens, the distant call of the wind against the trees. It was a peaceful life, one that had become theirs, and theirs alone. But more than the ranch itself, it was the simple, everyday things that had become the heart of their world. The mornings when they shared a quiet breakfast, the evenings when they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the sky. The nights when they worked side by side, the soft glow of lantern light flickering between them as they spoke in soft murmurs, sharing their thoughts without words. In time, Isabella had found herself letting go of the past entirely. She had burned the ring, and with it, the ties to a life she had never chosen. She had come to understand that it wasn't the past that defined her, but what she chose to do with the present. And with Lowell, she had chosen a future, one built on trust, love, and shared struggle. It wasn't the love she had imagined as a girl, all sweeping gestures and grand promises. But it was a love that was real. A love that had grown slowly, through moments of silent understanding, through quiet acts of care, through the work of living a life together. Isabella turned away from the horizon and walked inside, the door creaking softly as she entered the cabin. She found Lowell in the barn, finishing up with the horses. He looked up as she approached, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met, no words needed. She stepped forward, her heart beating a little faster, and without thinking, she reached out to him. Lowell stopped what he was doing, and his hands, warm from the task, took hers in a slow, gentle grasp. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was simply the touch of two people who had come to trust each other, who had come to understand that love isn't always about the grand gestures, but about the quiet moments. The small acts of tenderness. The shared space. The steady companionship. As Lowell leaned in, his lips brushing her forehead in the softest kiss, Isabella closed her eyes. In that moment, everything felt whole. The years of struggle, the weight of the past, all of it had led them here. And here, in the silence of their small ranch, in the glow of the firelight and the warmth of each other's touch, she knew this was where she was meant to be. Outside, the stars shimmered against the vast expanse of the sky, their soft light casting a gentle glow over the land. The wind had settled, and the earth, quiet and still, seemed to rest beneath the blanket of the night. And in the stillness of the moment, Isabella realized the truth that had been with her all along. Love, real love, wasn't about being swept away. It was about standing firm, side by side, through the storms and the quiet nights. It was about trust, tenderness, and the shared journey of two hearts that had once been strangers, but had become something more. What keeps a heart alive in the desert, she had once asked herself, when the world seemed barren and empty. And now, as she stood beside Lowell, her heart full, her soul at peace, she had the answer: a kiss, a scar, or the memory of one hand that never let go. And that was enough.